Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. After a couple weeks off, we are ready to start a new study, and we have decided to study the book of Second Corinthians. Couple of reasons we've decided to go with this book is one, I think it's fairly overlooked. We have First Corinthians that we study often, and we kind of maybe just move past Second Corinthians. People want to talk about not studying Revelation or Hebrews. I've found that people love those books. They love to dig into those difficult things, but Second Corinthians, that's where some true difficulties lie, and we have often overlooked those. And my fellow teacher here loves the book of Second Corinthians. So Ken, how are you doing tonight, and why are you excited to be studying this book?
First of all, I'm doing good. Second of all, I don't really know why I love the book of Second Corinthians. I just do. I guess maybe I could trace it back to having a good professor, Melvin Curry, who taught me the book of Second Corinthians and did it in a way that kind of built in a passion for me for the book. I just think it is, you're right, sometimes a neglected book of the New Testament, but I think just so many valuable lessons and just intriguing study. So I'm looking forward to this time that we end every Monday night in this important book of Second Corinthians.
Well, now that we're getting started again, we will continue our old schedule of 6:30 on Monday nights, and we'll just go every Monday night until we're done with the book. It's going to take a little while. Going to try and keep the videos between 20 and 30 minutes, like we did with Ephesians. And before we begin Second Corinthians, I think it's helpful to start with First Corinthians. We're not going to take but just a few minutes and just kind of roll through what was going on in First Corinthians and some of Paul's relationship with the Corinthians. It was a tenuous relationship. There was some stress to that relationship, but he still loved them. He wanted what was best for them. So we're going to think about some of those things this evening. Let's just start with Paul's kind of introduction to the Corinthians. We see him going to Corinth in Acts 18, verses 1 through 18. And we see Corinth here in the land of Achaia, or Greece, as we might term it today. Paul has gone up through over Asia Minor and has gone into Macedonia and has now come down into Corinth. And he is going to spend a good bit of time with them there. While he's there, he meets the brother and sister, or brother and sister in Christ, the couple, Aquila and Priscilla. I always have to stop, Ken, and make sure I'm not going to say Ananias and Sapphira.
I have that same hang up too. I don't know what it is. Two very different couples.
I know, for real, but I always double clutch there. I'm always like, oh, wait, who is it?
Who are the good ones?
Yeah, these are the good ones. So he spends some time with them, and he has a real good connection with them. They're in the same professional line of work. And so that gives them the ability to be together while they're teaching and be together while they're working with their hands, making some money to do what they're doing. While Paul is in Corinth, he goes about his normal pattern of going to the Jews, going to the synagogue and working with them, reasoning with them, studying with them. And when the Jews run him off, he does what he does. He turns to the Gentiles. But it's kind of interesting who he actually converts. Ken, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Who is the big convert here that's a little bit surprising?
I think, Pepper, you're looking for Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good, putting it in human terms, that's a pretty good score right there to get the ruler of the synagogue.
And a good lesson, kind of the sidetrack is here for a little bit, but preachers are good at that. A good lesson for evangelism. You know, we might look at this guy who was so invested in his job and his faith, and is not a very good evangelistic prospect. Right. He won't be interested in converting. It's going to cost him so much, but Paul did not let that deter him in the slightest.
Right. The people are not very happy with what's going on. They drag Paul before Gallio, who is the proconsul of Achaia. And this is one of the historical markers that we can use to fix Paul's work on a timeline. We won't go into that now, but if you read the commentaries, you'll see references to that. And he's not having it. He understands that this is a Jewish thing, that this is a squabble among them. And he says, if this were a real problem, I'd deal with it, but I'm not. You take care of it. Well, the people aren't the happiest with that. And we read in verse 17 that they seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue. Do you think, Ken, that this guy has already taken Crispus's place?
Yeah, most likely. Yeah.
I've kind of thought about that. Boy, Crispus converted and they got rid of him quickly. He didn't last much longer, but they take Sosthenes and they beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to this. He's kind of thinking, you're beating, your own people, then I'm not going to do too much about it. But we sometimes stop at verse 17. We really should continue to verse 18, as it says, after this, Paul stayed many days longer. So he doesn't just, get out of there like he has to when he's in Thessalonica. When he's in Thessalonica, he had to get out of there. But here, it doesn't seem that he's in immediate danger. God has told him that it might look dangerous, but he's got many people in the city. He will take care of them. Maybe an echo there of Elijah, when Elijah thought he was kind of alone. But Paul does stay a lot longer there, and then he sets sail for Syria as he returns to Jerusalem and kind of restart again.
I'll turn the tables on you, Jonathan, and put you on the spot.
Okay.
Verse 11 tells us that he was in Corinth for a year and 6 months. Verse 17, as you just pointed out, or excuse me, verse 18 says he still remained a good while. Do you think that was an addition to the year and a half, or is that including the year and a half?
My initial response would be that it probably is included within the year and a half, that Luke is probably making a general statement in verse 11 and not giving a timeline there. But I wouldn't be, I wouldn't fight you over thinking that verse 18 is in addition to the year and a half. What are your thoughts on that?
I would agree. I mean, the big answer is it doesn't matter how long he was there. But yeah, I would tend to agree that back Luke in verse 11 is kind of speaking in the big picture of the whole time that he spent there. But
right.
Again.
Well, that kind of covers, we don't get a lot of information from his second trip to Corinth and Acts. It kind of almost just in passing a little bit. So we won't worry about that too much. We do want to note Paul's relationship with the Corinthians. And if you open up any commentaries or any studies, you're going to see this phrase, and it's the Corinthian correspondence. It's when was Paul with them? When did Paul talk to them? How did they talk to Paul? How did Paul talk to them? There's a little bit of a timeline here. I want to go through this very quickly. We don't want to get bogged down in this. We're not writing a research paper here, but just as to where they have been talking. And Ken, if you have anything to add in here, just let me know. But I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. We've just read that Paul is in Corinth for 18 months, at least 18 months. And then we have in 1 Corinthians 5:9, we have the phrase, I wrote to you in my letter. Now, some use this to say that Paul had written a letter to them previously to 1 Corinthians. However, there is a grammatical use here. It's called the epistolary aorist. Ken, I know you hold this view that that's what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 5:9. Just quickly explain what that idea is and what it means that Paul is saying there.
Yeah, we get a little bit turned off the term epistolary aorist because I bet that's a phrase you didn't use all week.
That's right.
It's just a big fancy way of saying, by the time you read this, right, this is the tense in which I mean it.
Yes.
One example very quickly in Ephesians chapter 6, And in verse 22, in speaking of Tychicus, Paul says, whom I have sent to you for this very purpose, that you may know our affairs and that he may comfort your hearts. Paul writes that I have sent, the New King James says, but at the time that Paul penned that, he hadn't sent him yet. He was going to send him with the letter. And so, but by the time they read it, it would have been past tense. And so that's the sense in which I think Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9 means it, that I have written to you. You've already read that in this letter, in the sense, so that he's simply referring to the book of 1 Corinthians, that there's not a First Corinthians.
First Corinthians. That's a good way to put it. That's the technical term for it.
There you go.
There. So I think one reason people may like this idea is just the idea that there's a book out there that we don't have. And here we have reference to it, maybe like the books that are referenced in the historical books of the Old Testament. If you want to know more about this, it's written in the book of the kings of Judah and that kind of a thing. So maybe people just kind of like the idea that there's this First Corinthians floating around out there. We do have reference of a letter sent to Paul. With various questions. He's going to reference that in 1 Corinthians. We'll speak about that more in just a minute. There's information that is sent to Paul from Chloe's household. Some people were tattletelling, and I don't know how the congregation would have responded to that.
Jonathan, I might add here, it's possible that those two were one communique. Right. The letter sent to Paul with questions from the church at Corinth and the information sent from Chloe's household. It's possible that that's one letter or two letters in the same envelope, at least. Yeah.
So I keep a thing of Post-it notes right beside my keyboard, just for little quick things that I need to write down and remember. Yeah, it's possible that they had written this letter and that Chloe writes down, oh, by the way, the church is dividing. Let's get all this out in the open here. So then Paul responds with 1 Corinthians, which was written from Ephesus, probably delivered by Timothy. I think you can make a good case for that. Well, then you have over in 2 Corinthians 2, Paul references maybe a trip that Acts does not mention. And some refer to this as the sorrowful trip. It's a quick trip just across the sea there, in which maybe he tries to knock some heads together and make some sense of some things and tries to get them back in line. If that is the case, it didn't seem to work too well. And he still has some issues that he has to deal with. In 2 Corinthians 2:4, he writes about a tearful letter. And so some argue that there's another letter between what we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Corinthians 1.5, something along those lines. I'm pretty sure Ken is of the opinion that that's just a reference to 1 Corinthians. Paul holds nothing back in 1 Corinthians. You people are crazy. You have somebody in your midst who has his father's wife. Do something about this. What's wrong with you? As he writes about the Lord's Supper, I do not praise you in these things. Paul holds nothing back. It's not like the Philippian or the Thessalonian letter. He's really getting after them. And I'm of the opinion that this is probably just a reference to 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, the terms that Paul uses to refer to this missing, quote, missing letter are the words severe and with many tears.
Right.
I see no reason why both of those could not apply to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians was severe. If you've ever read it, you know it's a severe letter. And if you know the heart of Paul that you'll see in 2 Corinthians, it shouldn't be surprising that he wrote that severe letter with many tears.
Right, exactly. So finally, Titus and Paul are able to connect. They were supposed to connect in Troas. They weren't able to. They finally do get together. Titus has the report. And then Paul writes 2 Corinthians. And it seems, and we'll see this as we go through Corinthians, that it seems that they had responded to some things that Paul had instructed them. The man who has his father's wife, I'm convinced they had responded correctly in that way concerning him. And so most likely delivered by Titus from Macedonia.
I might point out that in my opinion, the most important one on this list is the one that says Titus returns to Paul with a report from Corinth. As we study the book of Second Corinthians, that visit and Paul's attitude waiting for that visit drives the spirit of Second Corinthians. You can imagine, again, Paul writes this stinging, severe letter, again, I believe with many tears, the First Corinthians. He sends it, and now he's waiting to see how it's going to be responded. Is this going to drive them further away from the Lord? Or is this going to have the intended effect of repentance? Paul is so disturbed in his spirit and so anxious to hear back. He just really, we would say today, I can't wait for Titus to get here to tell me the condition of the Corinthian brethren. That visit, that correspondence with Corinth, I think, is driving the spirit of Second Corinthians.
So just like the questions and the report from Chloe's household motivate First Corinthians, it's this discussion with Titus that motivates Second Corinthians, kind of sets the groundwork. That's a very good point, a good way of thinking about it, kind of keeping it straight in our minds. And then we see that Paul does visit Corinth again to gather the collection before he heads to Jerusalem with it. Paul had threatened them. I don't want to have to come down there. You can hear a parent in him. Do you want me to come to you in mercy? Or do you want me to come to you with a rod of anger? He says in 1 Corinthians, he's not happy about the situation. He knows that something is going to have to be done. It does seem that they finally responded, and Paul is able to kind of maybe get back to a more normal relationship with that congregation, maybe like he had with others. Maybe they had never had a normal relationship, but he does seem to feel maybe better about what's going on there. So kind of summarizing what letters we have First and Second Corinthians. Some argue, I'm not a proponent of this necessarily. I'm not saying that I think these are out there, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Even if Paul wrote 18 letters to the Corinthians, we only have 2 of them. So there's only so much you can do. But some argue that we have maybe Corinthians A, and this is referenced in First Corinthians. I think Ken has a very good explanation about the epistolary aorist, about how that could be worded. Then you have Corinthians B, which we would call First Corinthians. You have Corinthians C, which is maybe the sorrowful or the tearful letter. And I'm of the opinion that that's just First Corinthians. And then some argue that you have Corinthians D, and that is what we call Second Corinthians. Now, let me throw one more little wrench in this whole thing. We're not going to get into it, but some scholars argued that Second Corinthians is a conglomerate of a bunch of different letters. Some argue as much as 5, which is just getting ridiculous, especially since there's no manuscript evidence. Ken, the best I could do with them on that is maybe seeing Second Corinthians 10 through 13 as being like, oh, wait, I forgot to say this, because the tone changes so drastically from 8 and 9 to 10 through 13.
But in my mind, that almost just assumes that Paul would have sat down and wrote these letters from beginning to end in one setting.
Correct. Yeah.
And I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Something as long as this, it would have taken me months to write it.
I know, my hand's hurting thinking about it. Yeah. So possibly Paul writes 8 and 9 and then lets it sit, and he goes to get dinner, or he has some tents to make. And as he returns, maybe he's gotten a little fire in his belly about the situation and the tone check, because God is obviously using these humans to write these letters, these real relationships. And so I think that's a very good point, Ken. You have to assume that Paul is in one frame of mind for the entire writing of the letter. Well, humans aren't like that. Uh, and so why should we assume that Paul is like that in that regard? So at the end of the day, for the most part, Ken and I only are caring about Corinthians B and D, that is First and Second Corinthians. I think you can easily say that they might be the only two letters that Paul wrote, though we know that Paul did write other letters that we don't have. For example, he references the letter to the Laodiceans over in the book of Colossians. Uh, don't want to get too far upfield, Ken, but some people say that's the letter to the Ephesians. They make that connection. We didn't talk about that in our Ephesians class, and we're going to stop talking about it now. So let's just very quickly see what's going on in First Corinthians. I'm not going to take a lot of time. It seems like it's fairly clearly divided. First 6 chapters are the reports from Chloe's household, which is possible that the rest of the congregation didn't know that Paul had gotten this report. And I can see them reading this letter in their church services, and everybody kind of looking over at Chloe's household, be like, "You tattletale." But these are some bad things that Paul needed to know about, and Paul addresses very quickly and very sharply. Then we have questions from the Corinthians that they were asking about. So the issues with Chloe's household, there's divisions in the church. Some are of Paul, some are of Apollos, some are of Peter, some are of Christ. And Paul just says, "What are you thinking? I didn't die for you. This is all about Jesus. So let's not, let's not go off into these factions and have problems with that." He addresses a specific issue of sexual immorality. We see that they were taking one another to court, and he says, "Guys, you're just embarrassing yourselves." And then we have some discussion of general sexual immorality that he felt the need to deal with. And we can talk a bit more about that in just a moment. Then the questions from the Corinthians, it seems they had a question about marriage, had questions about meat offered to idols. They had questions about the covering, the Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts, the resurrection, and the collection. Let me tell you, this is the quickest you will ever study First Corinthians. And so, but we've studied these things before, and we know that Paul just goes from one issue to the next, really just fixing these issues as quickly as he possibly could here. Ken, any comments, any additions you want to make to that?
Maybe just a kind of an overarching statement that we remember from Acts chapter 18. We usually think of Corinth, and correctly so, as a very Gentile city. And then this church being a very Gentile church. But remember, there was a synagogue in Corinth, and that's where Paul began his work. And there were some converts from Judaism, including, as we pointed out, the ruler of the synagogue there. And so I think you talk about all the divisions, and that's what we normally remember from First Corinthians, all the sources of division. I think that it's possible that underlying most of those divisions was the common division problem in the first century church, and that's Jew and Gentile.
Yeah, I think that's quite possible there. So a lot of times you would cover this in an introduction to First Corinthians, but I think it's even more essential to understand it with Second Corinthians and why these people are chafing so much at Paul's apostleship and Paul's ministry there. They're not submitting, they're not having it. And what's going on there? Well, the Corinthians were a proud people. They felt very educated. They felt like they were philosophically minded. They were a pagan people. They gave themselves to these gods. You have the discussion of meat offered to idols. So for the most part, they were a pagan people, and the Jews maybe not so much, but the Christians or the Gentiles, are having to come out of that lifestyle there. They were a tolerant people. They would put up with new teaching. They would put up with wrong activity. We see that in First Corinthians 5, as they are almost proud of themselves that they can deal with this man who has his father's wife. And just to throw out here, to call someone a Corinthian at this time was really to call them a prostitute. So they were not only tolerant of different religious beliefs, they were tolerant of sexual immorality, which is where Paul has a rather large issue with them. And then not just Corinth, but the world at this time ran on the idea of honor and shame. And you were trying to climb this ladder of honor, and you did that by those you associated with. You did that by the things you did. You were always trying to pump yourselves up. And Paul comes in, maybe hunched over, not with good speaking style, it seems, that he wouldn't take their money. He had this weird discussion of the gospel. It would be almost the best example I can give are when the people of Beverly Hills saw the Clampetts roll in after they got all their money from the Beverly Hillbillies. They look at Paul and they're almost embarrassed to be too associated with him. And so they bristle, they chafe against his ministry. He's going to deal with that. He's going to say some very difficult things that I have the marks of a true apostle here. And so when you understand that mindset, I think you can better understand a lot of the things that Paul says in 2 Corinthians as he explains why he's doing the things he's doing. Ken, you got any comments on that?
Well, I'm just wondering, you've titled this slide, The Corinthian Mindset. Did you mean to put there 21st century America mindset?
Yeah, you're right.
I see a sermon there, don't
That's
you?
true.
Every one of those points is kind of in some way, not perfectly, but in some way matches our Gentile mindset today. But yeah, good points. And it does frame much of the argumentation in 2 Corinthians.
This has helped me. That's why I put this slide up, because I would read 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, excuse me. I'd be like, what is Paul talking about? Why is he talking about this? And you've got to understand the division between the church there and Paul. And once you understand that, a lot of what Paul says makes a lot more sense.
I might make one additional point that my home congregation is probably tired of me saying whenever we study these epistles, particularly the epistles of Paul, that another thing we need to keep in mind when we're studying these epistles, that the analogy that I use is that we're like reading letters from grandma's attic.
Yeah.
And that is, you go into grandma's attic, you find this box of letters, you're getting one side of a conversation. You don't have the letters that grandma sent. All you get is the letters that grandma received. Right. And it happened in a different time, different events were going on. Names were mentioned that you may or may not have ever heard of before. And so you're a bit of a disadvantage. Paul and the Corinthians knew exactly what was going on in their relationship, knew exactly the feelings the people at Corinth had, positive and negative, toward Paul. We have to do a little detective work when we're reading those letters and figure out, oh, if Paul is saying this, that must mean some in Corinth were thinking this. And so to me, that's part of the fun, the joy of studying the epistles, is that kind of detective work, was what was going on behind the scenes that prompted that discussion.
Right, exactly. And so that, if you ask me, is the best introduction to 2 Corinthians is 1 Corinthians. And so all I want to do here is just give you a very general division of 2 Corinthians. And in chapters 1 through 7, you have Paul talking about his ministry, why he's done some of the things that he's done, so that they can understand and maybe not look down on him so much. Their view of Paul was not very high. We probably are on the other extreme of that. And they did not have a great preference for him. We have a review of the collection for the saints. In chapters 8 and 9, he's going to kind of push them, telling them what the Macedonians have done. So he's going to talk about that in chapters 8 and 9. Fairly simple, easy discussion there. But then when he comes back a little hot. And he's going to deal with some people who have said some things about him, who have accused him of being maybe a low-rung apostle. And he kind of mocks these super apostles here, and he defends himself. He doesn't like doing it. He wishes he didn't have to do it. He even says this is foolishness. But I don't think the Corinthians would have listened otherwise. And if we're going to take this as an inspired document, which we obviously do, well, then the Holy Spirit said, all right, we don't want to, but it's time. We have to lay this out so that they can understand what's happening here. So that's really our introduction to Second Corinthians. And next week, we will start digging into the text here. Ken will lead us in a discussion of the first few verses. And I'm excited about this. I've never done an in-depth study of Second Corinthians, so I'm really excited. I'm going to be leaning heavily on Ken since he likes it so much and got to sit at Melvin Curry's feet about it. Ken, what do you have to close us off with here today?
Well, I share your excitement. I'm just looking forward to going through this book again and seeing what the Holy Spirit intended us to learn from this very, very valuable, inspired letter. I'm looking forward to that and hope to see you next Monday night.
Sounds good. We'll see you next time.